everybody. I want to welcome you all. It's an interesting thing being both the host and the speaker. You're just kind of standing around and you're like, somebody going to get this thing started and welcome me to the stage? And it's like, you should do both of those things. And so I'll get this started, and I will welcome myself to the stage and welcome all of you as well. This is the final event in the fall or the spring 2025 Common Word Community Read here at UNC Asheville. This is a series that I curate every semester. And so 3 times a semester we have evening events like this. They are always held here in the Reuters Center, here in this wonderful room. I want to thank Catherine Frank and her team for always making this space available to us, and the folks at the advancement office. Tonight it's Michael and Clary out there getting here in advance and setting up the room and kind of making it all possible. I haven't quite decided what our fall selection's going to be just yet. I was in the restroom and I was like, what are we doing this fall? And I was like, I haven't curated that part of the curating process just yet. But I think I'll probably choose a novel, maybe something a little more contemporary, and certainly something set in North Carolina, and organize some events around it. We had 2 wonderful events already this semester. Tom started us off with Thomas Wolfe at the Door, speaking about Thomas Wolfe growing up in Asheville and his family, and kind of blowing the lid off every casket and the door off every closet in town. Tom kind of walked us through some of that. And then our second event was a lecture by Kayla C., who is the site director at the Thomas Wolfe Memorial. And she talked about behind the scenes at Dixieland, how the house came into the possession of Julia Wolfe, and what the history of the house has been from its kind of construction to the many renditions of the house to coming into the property of the state and the ownership of the state. And also dealing with the fire and some of the interesting opportunities the fire itself, the arson itself, actually presented the memorial. It was really, really interesting. You can find both of those talks on the university's YouTube page. Unfortunately, the sound is not ideal. Tonight we're on Zoom, so for those of you watching at home, hopefully it sounds a little better. Probably doesn't look any better, sorry, but hopefully it sounds a little better, but you won't be looking at me all night. I'm going to share my screen quite a bit tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Wiley Cash. I am the Executive Director of Literary Arts here at the university. I teach in the English department, I teach fiction writing, and I teach literature classes. I am a novelist by trade, and I am also an alumnus of the university and benefited mightily from the things that I learned here. I can draw a straight line from the things I learned in the history classroom here to my first novel, and I can draw straight lines from the things that I learned in the creative writing classroom here to the novels that followed. And so I like to tell people that UNC Asheville gave me something to write about and then showed me how to do it. And I take it very seriously, trying to help students do just that. And I'm really happy that so many of my students have gone on to amazing graduate programs at University of Virginia, University of Alabama, Michigan, on full rides for creative writing, and are publishing really well-received books. And so it's really quite wonderful for me to be part of this tradition that I benefited from so greatly. And so tonight, I want to talk about another tradition that really benefited me. You'll see these 2 handsome North Carolinians on the screen there. The photograph on the left is of Thomas Wolfe, who you probably recognize. That was taken out west during Wolfe's final trip out west before he caught the disease that it would eventually end his life. The photograph on the right was taken against the wall in my living room in Wilmington, North Carolina. My wife took that. That was the author photo for my third novel, The Last Ballad. And so, Thomas Wolfe and I are pretty much the same. He also was very tall. And so we have a lot of similarities. Our height, and we both wrote about North Carolina, and that's pretty much where they stop.
Recording in progress.
You missed the funny joke, Rhett. That was the biggest laugh I'd gotten so far, and the people who watch it on recording are not going to hear it. So tonight, my craft talk is titled How the Magic Works, Breaking Down the Craft Elements in Look Homeward Angel. And I'll talk a little bit about what that title means in just a moment. But before I poison any expectation you might have, I want to go ahead and advertise my next talk, which is going to be this summer. I'm going to be offering 4 virtual classes through the Great Smokies Writing Program, specifically focusing on North Carolina writers. And I'm going to look at how scenes work in a handful of North Carolina novels and short stories. And so if you're a writer or a reader and you enjoy sitting through craft lectures, I would encourage you to take this. You can register at greatsmokies.unca.edu. Just click on the tab for summer classes. And I'll provide all of the materials you'll need. They'll all be online, or I'll email them to you in a PDF. But I just want to advertise that as we start, instead of at the end where you're like, I'm not taking this guy's summer class. So what do I mean by magic when I use the word magic? If you are a fan of Thomas Wolfe, and I was talking to my friend Chris at the door, and he was quoting, he's like, oh, I remember that scene. That's where, Ben said this. And I'm like, wow, you really have this down pretty cold. But if you're a fan of Thomas Wolfe, you know the quote, you can make magic in a dusty world. So Wolfe was all about making magic. And certainly the experience of reading Look Homeward Angel for many of us, regardless of whether we came to it as young people, as many of us did, and felt a kinship with Eugene Gant as he navigates the world, or if we came to it a little bit later in life, as I did, there's no doubt that reading Look Homeward Angel and reading many of Wolfe's other works is a very magical experience. And so that's kind of what I mean by magic. But I also mean something else. When you go see a magic show, and maybe many of you believe in magic, I don't know, but when you go see a magic show, or you go see someone do card tricks, or you see someone do sleights of hand, what they're really doing is they're distracting you. They're distracting you with one thing so that you don't notice what's happening over here. That's what writers do. We distract you with one thing so that you don't understand and fully comprehend what's happening to you emotionally. Writing is a subtle manipulation, especially for those of us who write realism. I tell people when I am writing, I want my world that I'm putting on the page to be so resonant of the world in which you live that you don't know where my book ends and where your life begins. It's like stepping into a pool on a warm day where the water is the same temperature as the air. You don't know that you've been in a swimming pool until you get out and your bathing suit is wet. That's how I want the reading experience to be for my readers. But you're holding a book in your hand. How do I get you there? Well, I've got to manipulate you. I've got to distract you. I've got to convince you that you are having experiences that you're not really having, that you are seeing the world through eyes that you're not really seeing the world through. So that's also what I mean by magic, the magic of subtle manipulation in a dusty world. So what do I mean by craft when I say craft elements? When I teach creative writing, like I do here at UNC Asheville or this online class that I'm going to teach this summer, I tell my students that I can't teach you how to be creative. You've either got that or you don't. I can't teach you where stories come from. You've got that or you don't. But I can teach you how to structure a story once you've got one. I can teach you how to design dialogue that flows. I can teach you 3-act structure or 5-act structure. And that's why, for me, writing is not a mystery. Writing is not magic. To me, writing is a craft the same way that being a carpenter is a craft, or being a landscaper is a craft. And that's something that I always make clear to my students. I say, if we were taking a gardening class And I came along behind you and I said, hey, excuse me, your bulb's buried a little too deep. Come spring, it's not going to reach the surface. You wouldn't throw down your shovel and scream, I'm never gardening again. So you can't do it when I tell you that this character is not believable. We gotta feel about our work the way we feel about our work. I'm not asking you to be detached from it. I'm asking you not to hold it too close and be too precious about it. And so for me, the art of writing is the act of craft, of bringing together craft elements. When I was a kid and growing up in Gastonia, North Carolina, on Sundays when we got out of school, we would go to the Cracker Barrel. Got out of church, Sunday school. We got out of church, we'd go to the Cracker Barrel, and then we would ride around and look at houses we couldn't afford. And when my wife and I first got together, she was like, why do you like riding around and looking at houses you can't afford? And we've been together for 15 years, and if we got an hour on our hands, she's like, you want to ride around and look at houses we can't afford? And I'm like, hop in, let's do it. And inevitably, on these Sunday afternoons, we would find a house that we couldn't afford that was being built, and we would get out of the car and we would always go into the house. And my dad, who was a pharmacist by training, was kind of a handyman at heart. He was constantly doing things at our house and other people's houses, building decks, building new rooms. When I was in junior high school, he cut a hole in my ceiling and put in staircases and put a room for me in the attic, so I had a 2-story room, just super cool, crazy stuff. But my dad would go into these houses. We would always find a loose window or, get in somehow. And all that to say my dad was a cat burglar, no. Wouldn't it be interesting if that's where this was going? My dad's been in jail since I was in junior high school. But when my dad was in the house, he was always interacting with the house. He was always touching the house. He was always looking at how floor joists were run. He was looking at how headers on doors had 2x4s. To bear the weight of the door. He was always looking at the angle of stairs. And what he was doing is he physically touched these things. We used to joke that he always knocked on everything. What he was doing is he was saying, is this real? Is this solid? What can I learn from this? And that's what I do when I read. When I read a piece of fiction, I'm reading it as a reader. I'm asking myself, can I disappear into this? Can this world of this novel or this short story become as real to me as the world in which I live? Also, what can I learn from this? What craft elements can I learn? Can I learn how to hang a door? Can I learn how to set a staircase? Can I learn the code for setting out a roof or shingles? My dad was always taking these things in. And so when I think about that, I think about Gothic cathedrals. If you went to UNC Asheville and you took Humanities 324, you know a thing or two about Gothic cathedrals. Gothic cathedrals were designed to lift our eyes to heaven, right? And why during the Middle Ages would we want to lift our eyes to heaven? Well, it's because the world is full of the bubonic plague, and there are rats and people with swollen armpits and lymph nodes and mass death in the streets and all kinds of war. So when you went to the church, the nave lifted your eyes up to heaven, and the stained glass windows lifted your eyes up to heaven, because the designers, the architects, the artists wanted you to lift your eyes up to the heavenly realm and not think about what is happening here on earth. And that way it was easier for them to get their hands into your pockets when you were distracted looking up and you didn't feel it. You were so overcome by the Spirit, you didn't feel the clamoring for your 2 pence or however much they were taking from you. And so inside the church, you're having this magical, transformative experience. And on the outside of the church are these ugly structures called flying buttresses that nobody really cares about. And they're bearing the weight of the nave and the walls and the windows and everything. And they're working to make sure that cathedral doesn't fall in on you while you're inside of it. As a writer and a teacher, I'm interested in the flying buttresses, much more so than I'm interested in the reasons why people go to church. I want to know how the church stands. I want to know how a work opens and closes and how you can walk inside of it without it collapsing on you. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight with a couple of scenes from Look Homeward, Angel. Wolfe, instead of turning your eyes to heaven, Thomas Wolfe wants you to turn your eyes to the distant soaring ranges so that you can't see how he's pulling off the trick. But tonight we're going to get to the bottom of it. So a few craft elements that I'll discuss tonight. I'll discuss characterization, dialogue. I'll discuss this difference between scenes and narrative summary, description and narration. And some of these things might be things that you already know. We know what characterization is. We know what dialogue is. Maybe we don't know what narrative summary is off the top of our head. We know what description is. Maybe we have an idea of what narration is, but I'm going to talk about how Thomas Wolfe uses these things in scenes and narrative summary to pull off that magic, to get you there, to have you in, the Penland small smoky cabin in Yancey County, how he gets you on that train with W.O. Gant as he comes up from Raleigh and into Old Fort. A little bit about my own Thomas Wolfe Genesis story. This is my copy of Look Homeward, Angel. I bought it at the Memorial in the gift shop there. This would have been the spring of 2023. I'd never read Look Homeward, Angel before. When I came to Asheville to go to the university in 1996, I knew vaguely of who Thomas Wolfe was, just by virtue of being born and raised in North Carolina. I didn't visit the Memorial, and then I believe the arson was in 1998. And so for the majority of the time I lived in North Carolina, in Asheville, which was 96 to 03, the Memorial was closed. And so you could visit the gift store, the gift shop, and the museum part, but you couldn't go into the house. And my sister and I were walking around downtown one day before I left to go to graduate school in Louisiana, and we stopped in for some reason. And I thought, I've never read this. This looks like a fast read. I'll give that a shot before I move to Louisiana. When I got down to Louisiana, I was desperately homesick for Western North Carolina. I was desperately homesick for fresh water, for bluegrass music, for the accents I'd grown up hearing, for the food I'd grown up eating, for Sundrop, which they didn't sell in Louisiana, to my dad's great horror. He was like, do they sell Winston Lights, or do I need to bring those with me too? And so I turned to Look Homeward, Angel, and almost immediately upon opening it, I found that when I read this novel, I'm by now probably 25 years old. I found that when I read this novel, I could go back to a place that I loved. And for me, as it is for so many people, it wasn't identifying with Eugene Gann. I never really found Eugene all that interesting. To be honest, I still don't. To me, he's the least interesting person in the novel. I found the portrayal of Asheville as a place that I knew, and seeing these streets that I knew, even if they were disguised, that Thomas Wolfe looked at this place and looked at people and said, you are worth literature. That meant something to me. I'm from Gastonia. I've written about Gastonia. Gastonia is not a place that we normally think of as being worth literature, but I think every place is. I constantly fight against students and their ideas that the story is somewhere else. The story is in New York City. The story they've read On the Road, and they think, I'm going to write a novel about a guy hitchhiking from New York City to San Francisco. I'm like, great, you've read one novel. Let's read another one and see if you want to write about that, right? It's great to have influences. We all come to the page for different reasons. But so often young people think the story is somewhere else. And I ask them, well, where are you from? Well, I'm from Mount Airy. I'm from Gastonia. I'm from Brevard. Nothing ever happens there. Nothing ever happens there. And I said, well, have you had your heart broken? Did you disappoint your parents? Did you experience grief? Did you lie? Were you lied to? Did you find out that adults lie? What do you think novels are about? What do you think novels set in New York City or LA or London, what do you think those novels are about? Everything you're ever going to write about has already happened to you by the time you first think about writing. Writing is not an act of creating as much as it is an act of remembering. We're not reaching into the future to write. We're not writing about some far-off place we've never had the money to visit. We're remembering what it was like to lie to our parents. We're remembering what it was like to be cheated on or to cheat. We're recalling. And so we're all walking around with this backpack full of amazing stuff. And Thomas Wolfe realized that much younger than most of us do. And so when I read Look Homeward, Angel, that's what stayed with me, that where I'm from is worth writing about, and the places that I know are worth putting on the page. So when I was in graduate school, I became very, very interested in Thomas Wolfe, and I read Look Homeward, Angel. I read most of his novels while I was living in Louisiana, and I was at a conference in Baton Rouge, the American Studies Association conference, and I was in line for a drink or the buffet, and I was talking to a young woman from another university who found out I was from North Carolina, and she was like, "Oh, do you like Thomas Wolfe?" And I was like, "Whoa, do you like Thomas Wolfe?" And she's like, "I do," and I was like, "So do I." And so she's like, "Have you ever written about Wolfe?" And I said, "Actually, right now I'm at work on a paper about the lost boy and the American Adam. And it's my argument that," and this gentleman in front of her turned around and said, "That sounds like a very interesting paper. You should submit it to the Richard S. Kennedy contest. And if you win, you can come to the Thomas Wolfe Society meeting. This year it is in Chapel Hill or whatever." This is with Joseph Flora, a longtime professor at UNC Chapel Hill. And so I did. I submitted my essay, and I won the student prize, and I went to my first Thomas Wolfe Society meeting and met a handful of folks that are in this room tonight. And I've been a Wolfe fan ever since. And that girl and I never talked again. But that's how focused on my studies I was. That's when I knew I was going to devote my life to this and not something more meaningful. I'm teasing. But the longer I stayed a part of the Wolfe Society, the more opportunities I had to study Wolfe. And one of the most transformative experiences I had was the first time I won the William B. Wisdom Grant to go to Harvard to visit the Widener Library, where about 2,000, I think 2 tons or something of Wolfe's material is stored, his original papers. And I was working on an essay about Wolfe's early plays, Welcome to Our City, which is set here in Asheville, which portends much of the gentrification that is happening in the Eagle Street area. Thomas Wolfe was hip to that way back in about 1921. It's quite a good play, to be honest. That and Manor House, his 2 earliest play, or 2 of his earliest plays. But at some point in my research, I came across a hand-drawn map that he had drawn of downtown Asheville. And all the streets are there, Biltmore, Walnut, all of them were there. And he had crossed out the names of the streets and written what he was going to call them in Look Homeward, Angel. And it's not a find, everybody knew that was there, but for me, I felt like I was holding a Rosetta Stone. And it was as if there's been a few moments in my life when I felt like history was reaching toward me as I was reaching toward it, and that was one of those moments. And so when I talk about magic, and I'm trying to be dismissive of Wolfe's magic, here I am telling you a story about a very, very magical experience that I had. And then I went out and walked in Harvard Square, and a guy threw up in front of me, literally. I was like, that was the most blah. Felt like I was back in Asheville. So the power of Wolfe's language is incredibly powerful, and that's one of the things that he's known the most for, this torrent of language. And we see this torrent of language most often from the narrator of his work, right? So when a piece of fiction, even if it's written in third person, there is a narrative voice. And Woolf's narrative voice is often speaking in this torrent of language. And when people think of Woolf's literature, that's oftentimes what they think of, is being overwhelmed by the verbosity and the power of this language washing over them. And in this language are very often some very, very beautiful descriptions. Images are just being tossed at you. And images are very, very powerful. And we have to remember that Woolf is coming out of, or going into kind of the Imagist movement, which was kind of defined by poets like Ezra Pound and Amy Lowell and William Carlos Williams, these poets that are dealing almost solely in images and how to see things new for the first time, the modernist impulse of make it new, 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, faces in the station of the metro. How can we see something in a way we've never seen it before? And so Woolf is hurling these images at us. And that's oftentimes what people think of. And sometimes contemporary readers say, well, that's just what he did. He couldn't do the fine stuff, right? He could dump water on you, but he couldn't drip water on you. And he can, and he does, and he did. And when we look back at Look Homeward Angel, and if we read Look Homeward Angel closely, I think the magic is that it's these finely drawn scenes that are resonating with us. It's these characterizations, it's these fine moments, and not the torrent of words that's affecting us to the degree that we think it is. I want to open tonight, I'm going to talk about 3 excerpts, and I'm going to read a little bit to you tonight, and I hope that won't bore you too terribly. I'm going to read probably the first third of the book, and then we'll take a break. I'll have a ginger ale, and then we'll come back in. Class, they don't have class tomorrow here until 9. So, I know. Cory Booker, here we come, Cory Booker. I got on a Depends diaper. We'll see what happens. But one of the I'm gonna read 3 excerpts tonight. One of them is primarily narrative summary, and I'll talk about what narrative summary is in just a moment. But the other 2 are scenes, and these are 3 of my favorite parts of the novel that affected me greatly, but maybe for different reasons. The first part I want to read, and you notice that I'm not saying scene. The first part that I'm going to read is the excerpt when W.O. is on the train coming in from Sydney, which we know is based on Raleigh. And he stops off at Old Stockade, which we know is Old Fort, and he switches over to a coach and finishes coming up the mountain. But I wanted to give you this image. This is the train out of Old Fort, which wouldn't have existed. The train was being worked on in the excerpt, which I'll read in a moment. But if you want to read a wonderful novel about the work on the railroad, check out John Ely's The Road. Just a wonderful novel. And while you're at it, look at the Rail Project, all caps, R-A-I-L, that Professor Emeritus Dan Pierce has put together, excavating the histories of essentially enslaved convict laborers who built that railroad, many of whom's bodies are buried alongside the tracks in unmarked graves, maybe by the hundreds, certainly by the dozens. So I'm going to read this excerpt, and then we'll talk a little bit about the magic at work in this excerpt. So forgive me if you hate my voice. The train rattled on over the reeking earth. Rain fell steadily. A brakeman came draftily into the dirty plush coach and emptied a scuttle of coal into the big stove at the end. High, empty laughter shook a group of yokels sprawled on 2-turn seats. The bell tolled mournfully above the clacking wheels. There was a droning, interminable wait at a junction town near the foothills. Then the train moved on again across the vast rolling earth. Dusk came. The huge bulk of the hills was foggily emergent. Small, smoky lights went up in the hillside shacks. The train crawled dizzily across high trestles spanning ghostly howsers of water. Far up, Far down, plumed with wisp of smoke, toy cabins stuck to bank and gulch and hillside, the train toiled sinuously up among gouged red cuts with slow labor. As darkness came, Oliver descended at the little town of Old Stockade where the rails ended. The last great wall of the hills lay stark above him. As he left the dreary little station and stared into the greasy lamplight of a country store, Oliver felt that he was crawling like a great beast into the circle of those enormous hills to die. The next morning, he resumed his journey by coach. His destination was the little town of Altamont, 24 miles away beyond the rim of the great outer wall of the hills. As the horses strained slowly up the mountain road, Oliver's spirit lifted a little. It was a gray, golden day in late October, bright and windy. There was a sharp bite and sparkle in the mountain air. The range soared above him, close, immense, clean, and barren. The trees rose gaunt and stark. They were almost leafless. The sky was full of windy white rags of cloud. A thick blade of mist washed slowly around the rampart of a mountain. Below him, a mountain stream foamed down its rocky bed, and he could see little dots of men laying the track that would coil across the hill toward Altamont. Then the sweating team lipped the gulch of the mountain, and among soaring and lordly ranges that melted away in purple mist, they began the slow descent toward the high plateau on which the town of Altamont was built. In the haunting eternity of these mountains, rimmed in their enormous cup, he found sprawled out on its 100 hills and hollows a town of 4,000 people. There were new lands. His heart lifted. So I want to look at some of the words here, but first I want to ask you to think about the turn here, the turn that happens in this excerpt that I read. And when I say turn, I'm talking about the emotional turn that happens here. That Oliver begins that trip feeling one way and ends that trip feeling another way. Before I go any further, I want to say that the best writing doesn't focus on only one emotion. It focuses on at least two. Because if you focus on one emotion, that's called melodrama. That's when you are pushing an emotion to its illogical conclusion. That's why we tell people, stop being melodramatic. You're being melodramatic. You need to be more nuanced than you're being right now. But if you give people two emotions or three emotions, then we know something. Then we know something. If we can have these little turns in the text, then we're getting somewhere. Then we're on a real journey that's going somewhere and not just having us stand in place and feel one way. Turns are what hook us when we're reading. Melodrama does not hook us. It does not compel us to keep reading. But emotional turns are what hook us. They make us think, and they make us appraise what's happening on the page, and they make us judge. They make us have judgment calls, and that causes us to feel. When we are on a straightaway of melodrama, we lose our bearings. We go careening headlong into an emotion, whether we're reading that emotion or experiencing that emotion. But if we hit a turn, what do we have to do? We have to slow down. We have to readjust. We have to reconsider. We have to re-see the situation and reevaluate how we feel about this thing. Turns are the result of being forced in an opposite direction, which interrupts the inertia of reading. John Gardner said that fiction writing is a vivid and continuous dream. That's what you want your reader to be experiencing. And you never want to wake them up from the dream. And turns don't necessarily wake them up from the dream, but they certainly complicate the inertia of reading. It causes the reader to make judgments. It causes the reader to feel, causes the reader to come to conclusions about how situations and characters change. And that's how we get to know people, is when they change. Let's look at some of these words that are used in the first half of that excerpt. Mournfully, sparsely, futile, grubbing, cold and leaden, grisly, hard, sallow woman, grimy baby, rattled, mournfully, droning, ghostly, gouged. Let's look at some of the words in the second half of that excerpt. Lifted, gray golden, bright, immense, clean, soaring, lordly ranges, purple mist, high plateau, and then again, lifted. So the language is reflecting the emotional turn that Thomas Wolfe wants you to feel, because this is the emotional turn that W.O. Gant is experiencing in this moment. If he had borne down on this, I don't think that scene would have been as powerful. If it had just stopped, he stopped at an old stockade. It was ghostly and gouged and droning and mournful. The next morning, he was in Asheville, right? We wouldn't have had that experience. We wouldn't have had that lift that Gant's experiencing, and that's what Thomas Wolfe wants you to feel. That's magic. That's magic. Also, you'll notice that it was October in that excerpt. There are only ever 2 months in Thomas Wolfe's literature. It's always October or it's always April. It's always the month of dying or it's always the month of coming back into life again like April. That's actually a line, coming into life again like April. And talk about turns. Talk about moving between polarities and conjuring what these months mean to us. October with all of its nostalgia, with the smells of moldering leaves, with fires in the distance, with the turns of the trees on the hills. And then April with the blooming of the trees and the showers and the rebirth and the smell of sun-warmed mud, pulling us constantly between those tensions. Wet gray sky of October, the light wind of April fanned over the hill. Spring lay strewn lightly like a fragrant gauzy scarf upon the earth. My God, how beautiful. How beautiful is that writing? But it's that pole, it's the tension between those 2 months that he's really operating in so often. It's the language of death or it's the language of rebirth. And I'm wondering why, aside from those literary devices he chose to write about those months, and if Kayla were here, maybe she could say, or maybe Tom or Chris, you would know, given your proximity to the memorial, but I'm wondering if that's when the tenants in the boarding house were most often coming and going. If they were coming to see the fall leaves, if they were coming to see the spring blooms, I'm not sure. Maybe those were always seasons of change, not only in the natural world, but in his household. And like a good writer who lives in the world, but also apart from the world, maybe he was watching those things. And these tensions are what make writing good. One of my favorite songwriters has a song that opens, "You're gonna leave, I better get used to that." Right? You're gonna leave, but I better be okay with it. Another one of my favorite songwriters is a guy from down where I'm from named David Childers. And he has a song that says, "There are moments of grace, this ain't one of those." Talk about a turn, right? So, narrative scene versus summary. Gant's coming to Altamont is an example of narrative summary. And I can talk about what these things are exactly. Narrative summary compresses time. It's where we take what is probably a 24-hour trip or a 36-hour trip, and we go, 2 paragraphs. We're gonna tell this story. We're gonna tell this whole experience in 2 paragraphs. We're gonna use a sentence to say, 4 years of college floated past, and then she was 22. That's narrative summary. It's where we take time and we condense it down. But narrative summary is also where causality is vested. Causality is why characters do the things they do. That narrative summary is where causality is vested, and I'll unpack that a little more clearly in just a moment. Scene, on the other hand, as opposed to narrative summary, is real time. Scene on the page works like scene as if you were seeing it. Scene is time, actual. Narrative summary is time compressed. Narrative summary is where causality is vested. It's where people learn of the reasons why they are going to do the things they do. Scene is where they do the things. I like to tell students that it's similar to if you go on a date with somebody. So the narrative summary is where characters are told about. Scene is where characters are shown. Narrative summary is where somebody says, "Oh my gosh, I got the perfect girl for you. She is so beautiful. She's like successful. She gets along with her family. She's totally normal." That's narrative summary. The date is where you see if they were telling you the truth or not. That's scene. And let me tell you, it can clock time. You might be like, "Oh my God, I didn't know dinner at Barley's was going to take this long." So there are 5 elements of scene, and I'm aware of our time, but there are 5 elements of scene. There is exposition, description, narration, dialogue, and interiority. Exposition is just the information you need to know when you're going into a scene. What do you need to know as the reader to make this scene matter? Description is the description of what the people look like, what the setting looks like, what the POV, the point of view, can smell and hear and see. Narration is characters moving through space. It's what people are doing with their hands. When I worked at Ingalls in college down here at Beaver Lake, we had a night manager who was kind of a big, beefy guy, and he always wore a tie. And as he walked, he touched the knot on his tie. Every step, it was like a pendulum. His hand came up and he straightened his tie. If I was going to write about this night manager, that bit of narration would be very, very important. It's also what people do with their hands when they're talking. They spin their wedding ring, they rattle the change in their pockets, they get up and look out a window and they pause for a beat, and you can tell they're thinking, and then they turn around and say, "I'm leaving you," or "Don't leave me," or "Take my summer writing workshop." And then dialogue, of course. Dialogue, it's like, "Oh, well, that's simple. That's just people talking," right? That's just people talking. I can write dialogue. And I'm sure you can write a story of 2 people talking, but dialogue is very important because in dialogue, the dialogue has to be for the characters and the reader. It at least has to be for the character, hopefully for both. You can never have characters tell each other things they already know because you need the reader to know them. You can't have a scene where a couple wakes up in bed and the husband turns over and says, "We've been married 50 years today." And the wife goes, "I know." That's for the reader. That's for the reader. But if the husband says, "We've been married 50 years today," and the wife says, "And it seems like so much longer," that's for the character and the reader. We're both learning something there. So dialogue is not just two characters talking. It's 2 characters exchanging information that the reader needs to know or the character needs to know, hopefully both. It's always new. And then interiority, if you have a point of view character, that's what that character is thinking in the moment. She couldn't believe he talked to her that way. She didn't know what to say next, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. What is that character thinking, that anchor character, that point of view character? So I'm going to read another brief scene that's one of my favorite scenes in the novel, and I'm going to talk about how these craft elements work in this scene. This is the scene of W.O. meeting Julia's family for the first time. This is the picture of the real life W.O. Wolfe and Julia Wolfe. "Father," Eliza had said with ladylike dignity as she led Oliver for the first time into the sitting room of the cottage, "I want you to meet Mr. Gant." Major Pentland rose slowly from his rocker by the fire, folded a large knife, and put the apple he had been peeling on the mantel. Bacchus looked up benevolently from a whittled stick, and Will, glancing up from his stubby nails, which he was paring as usual, greeted the visitor with the bird-like nod and wink. The men amused themselves constantly with pocket knives. Major Pentland advanced slowly toward Gant. He was a stocky, fleshy man in the middle 50s with a ruddy face, a patriarchal beard, and the thick, complacent features of his tribe. "It's W.O. Gant, isn't it?" he asked in a drawling, unctuous voice. "Yes," said Oliver, "that's right." "From what Eliza's been telling me about you," said the major, giving the signal to his audience, "I was going to say it ought to be L.E. Gant." The room sounded with flat, pleased laughter of the Penlands. "Whew," cried Eliza, putting her hand to the wing of her broad nose. "I'll vow, Father, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." Gant grinned with a thin, false painting of mirth. The miserable old scoundrel, he thought. He'd had that one bottled up for a week. "You've met Will before," said Eliza. "Both before and aft," said Will with a smart wink. When their laughter had died down, Eliza said, "And this, as the fella says, is Uncle Bacchus." And so they talk a little bit about Bacchus. Then, amid their laughter, the door opened and several of the others came in. Eliza's mother, a plain-worn Scotchwoman, and Jim, a ruddy, porcine young fellow, his father's beardless twin, and Thaddeus, mild, ruddy, brown of hair and eye, bovine, and finally Greeley, the youngest, a boy with lapping idiot grins, full of strange, squealing noises at which they laughed. He was 11, degenerate, weak, scrofulous, but his white, moist hands could draw from a violin music that had in it something unearthly and untaught. And as they sat there in the hot little room with its warm odor of mellowing apples, the vast winds howled down from the hills, there was a roaring in the pines, remote and demented. The bare boughs clashed, and as they peeled or pared or whittled, their talk slid from its rude jocularity to death and burial. They drawled monotonously, with evil hunger, their gossip of destiny and of men but newly lain in the earth. And as their talk wore on and Gant heard the spectre moan of the wind, he was entombed in loss and darkness, and his soul plunged downward in the pit of night, for he saw that he must die a stranger. That all but these triumphant Pentlands who banqueted on death must die. And like a man who was perishing in the polar night, he thought of the rich meadows of his youth, the corn, the plum tree, and ripe grain. Why here, oh lost? When we look at that scene, we look at the exposition. The exposition. What are the things that we need to know about these people? The men constantly had knives. That tells you something about being a courter, walking into a room where the men all have knives out, right? We need to know that they always have these knives. We need to know this about Greeley, about kind of this strange gothic vibe of this family. He doesn't play music in this moment, but the narrator thinks to tell us about his talents nonetheless, that he's a savant of sort. Because why? Because it gives us, it exposes, which is the root of exposition, it exposes something about these people. So exposition here is really, really important. But what about description? Well, we learn what Major Pentland, Eliza's father, looks like. We learn how he moves as he goes toward Gant. We learn what the night sounds like. We learn what the room feels like, and something that many writers often overlook, we learn what it smells like. We are there. We feel it, see it, and hear it, and we smell it. We're appealing to 4 of the 5 senses. We are there with that description. And then narration. We need to know how these people move. How do they move through space? Pentland rises slowly. Bacchus looks up benevolently. And Will has that curt nod and the wink. We know who these people are by how they move. So as they're introduced to us, Thomas Wolfe is tagging. This guy moves slow. This guy is benevolent. This guy is bird-like and quick-witted. We know who these people are. He's not wasting time on characterization. and telling us, Will was a shifty guy who had a sly sense of humor. He's showing us in the narration with their movements who these people are. For somebody who gets blasted for lack of control, the economy of the language here is pretty remarkable. And then we have the dialogue. Dialogue, as I said, should always share knowledge with the reader and the character. In this quip from Pentland to W.O. about we thought it must be elegant because you're a city boy, we're all learning something. That is incredibly powerful dialogue. We read and engage in dialogue with each other to share new ideas and to learn new ideas. We don't tell each other things we already know. So you and Eliza have been dating 3 months. Yes, sir, 3 months. Well, thanks for coming by. That's not a good scene. We don't learn anything about anybody in that scene. They've got to share new information with each other and with the reader. And then interiority. We have to know what Gant is thinking. We get that little moment of interiority when he thinks, that son of a bitch has been saving that line for a month, right? But then the real interiority comes at the end, and that's also where the turn is. This scene, which began humorously, grows ominous with the appearance of Greeley. It grows ominous and gothic with the appearance of Greeley. And by the end of the scene, as the weather is changing outside and becoming violent and dark and unpredictable, Gant is realizing in his mind, it is Gant thinking this because he's our POV character. He's the camera through which we're perceiving everything. He's the camera and the brain. Not just the camera and the brain here. We know how he feels. And he says, look at these people. I will never be part of these people. This is so insular. This is so clannish. I am going to walk the earth as a stranger for the rest of my life. And that's Gant's defining intellectual feature in the novel that Eugene adopts, that we are always a stranger. We are always alone. That's the turn here. This comedic scene that has us laughing at the beginning has us thinking about our own place in the world by the end. That feels like magic to me. I want to move really quickly. I'm aware of time and just on the chance that y'all have any questions for me about anything that I've said tonight. I want to talk about another one of my favorite scenes in the novel that's kind of overlooked in its power. One of my favorite characters is Ben, which is Eugene's older brother. I think the next one up in age. And he says that Ben looked like light flashing across a blade, a very tough character, a very fatalistic character with a very existential mindset. A quiet, brooding character. And I've just always had such a soft spot for Ben as Wolf did. And the famous scene with Ben is Ben's death scene. And you know, you can't go into the house without looking up at that window or going into that room and thinking about the death scene, the death of Ben. But my favorite scene with Ben is the scene where Eugene has come back from college after his freshman year. And he and Ben are having a conversation about what was life like down at Pulpit Hill. Did the old man send you enough money to get along? And forgive me, while I'm reading this, think about things like exposition, dialogue, narration. What are the characters doing? What does the dialogue mean? Where is the turn? What do we need to know going into this? What does the text give us to know? What does it expose? What is the description? What is the interiority? Did the old man send you enough money to get along on? Ben asked. Were you able to hold your own with the other boys? He can afford it, you know. Don't let him stint you. Make him give it to you, Gene. I had plenty, said Eugene, all I needed. This is the time you need it, not later, said Ben. Make him put you through college. This is an age of specialization. They're looking for college-trained men. Yeah, said Eugene. He spoke obediently, indifferently, the hard, bright male of his mind, undented by the jargon. Within, the other one, who had no speech, saw. I'm going to pause there. That's interiority. Within the other one, within Eugene, that can't quite explain, can't put a word to what he's about to feel, still sees it, and you'll see it too. So get your education, said Ben, scowling vaguely. All the big men, Ford, Edison, Rockefeller, whether they had it or not, they say it's a good thing. Why didn't you go yourself? Said Eugene, curiously. I didn't have anyone to tell me, said Ben. Besides, you don't think the old man would give me anything, do you? He laughed cynically. It's too late now. He was silent a moment. He smoked. You didn't know I was taking a course in advertising, did you? He asked, grinning. No, where? Through the correspondence school, said Ben. I get my lessons every week. I don't know, he laughed diffidently. I must be good at it. I make the highest grades they have, 98 or 100 every time. I get a diploma if I finish the course. A blinding mist swam across the younger brother's eyes. He did not know why. A convulsive knot gathered in his throat. He bent his head, quickly fumbled for a cigarette. In a moment, he said, I'm glad you're doing it. I hope you finish, Ben. You know, said Ben seriously, they've turned out some big men. I'll show you the testimonials sometimes. Men who started with nothing. Now they're holding down big jobs. I hope you do, said Eugene. So, you see, you're not the only college man around here, said Ben with a grin. In a moment, he went on gravely. You're the last hope, Gene. Go on and finish up. If you have to steal the money, the rest of us will never amount to a damn. Try to make something out of yourself. Hold your head up. You're as good as any of them. A damn sight better than these little pimps about town. He became very fierce. He was very excited. He got up and suddenly from the table. Don't let them laugh at you. By God, we're as good as they are. If any of them laugh at you again, pick up the first damn thing you get your hand on and knock him down. Do you hear? In his fierce excitement, he snatched up the heavy carving steel from the table and brandished it. Yeah, said Eugene awkwardly. I think it's going to be all right now. I didn't know how to do it at first. So what is the turn there? The turn has been saying, you're not the only college man. Pausing, that's narration. Taking a breath and saying, you're the last hope, Eugene. We're not going to amount to a damn thing. Despite what I'm doing to improve myself, despite my limited opportunities here in Altamont, you're the one we've got everything riding on. And so if we think about how magic works, it's those elements, those building blocks of writing, dialogue, description, exposition, interiority, and narration that are making this language feel like magic and making us begin a scene one way in pride, right? And then ending in its opposite, which is shame. The best scenes begin on one emotion and end on another. They begin in October and they end in April. And that's what Thomas Wolfe does over and over again. So as much as we talk about his language and this torrent of words and these beautiful images, it's these scenes that I think really hook us. And it's these characterizations and these small moments where these characters are cracked open and show us a little bit about who they are. Wolfe's magic lies not in his language, but in his ability to use craft elements to destabilize the reader within a scene or a piece of narrative summary. We are constantly drawn into turns that manipulate our emotions. And then come take my summer class with Great Smokies. I will pause there, and if anybody has any questions about anything I've said here or about my very limited knowledge of Thomas Wolfe or anything like that, I would love to answer any questions y'all might have in the time that we've got left. They have these microphones so that we have 1,000 people on Zoom right now. 1,012 now, I'm teasing. They'll be able to hear us with these microphones. And I will say that the Look, Homeward Angel came out in 1929. And that book the words in that book have not changed, just like the words in my books do not change. The only things that change are the questions. So if y'all have questions, I always enjoy questions. So if you have them, I'd love to answer them. Yes, sir.
Well, this shows my lack of knowledge of creative writing and all, but all these things that you're talking about, the expose, narrative, and so forth. Is that something that's been developed for a long time for writers? And would Wolfe have been sitting down, writing that scene, thinking about those things?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Those 5 elements of scene come from a craft book that a buddy of mine wrote named Michael Cardos. He has a great kind of simplified guide to writing called The Art and Craft of Fiction. And those 5 elements of scene I cribbed from him. And I think there are some other things that you can do, but for scenes, to me, those are the 5 building blocks. And sometimes I can say from my own experience writing, and I'm not going to share my experience because it's perfect, it's just the experience that I know best. Sometimes if I have a good writing day and I write for 2 hours, I will go back and I will see things like this at work in my prose. And if they're not there, I'll put them in. And if they are there, I'll turn them up or turn them down. And so, narrative has always been with us, from the earliest oral narratives to serialized narratives in Victorian England. And it's been remarkably consistent along these craft elements. And so while we might not be thinking about them consciously, they are so ingrained in how we tell stories. Even those of us who do not think of ourselves as storytellers, we know we've got to have description. Then I went to the window, looked out, that's narration. And I was thinking, that's interiority. And I said, that's dialogue. And he said back, we do these things naturally. And in the first draft, we might not be conscious of them. But in the revision, we have to be conscious of them. And the more we tell the same stories over and over, the better we get at telling them. And it's because we're pulling from these craft elements that we might not know we know, but we still know them. For example, my kids, I kind of go on and on with them about stuff. Whenever I read to them or they're reading a book, I'll say, can we stop? Do you see what they're doing here? Do you know what they're setting up? Are you seeing how this is working? And my daughter, a couple of years ago, our oldest, came home from school and she said, oh my gosh, y'all, I told the scariest story today at school. It was about these 2 kids walking through a cemetery. I didn't give them names because I didn't want them to focus on the names and not focus on other stuff, so I just called them the boy and the girl. And I was like, gosh, I wish my undergraduates knew that you didn't have to give every single character a name. Because when you give somebody a name, you're telling the reader, hold on to this. And your reader can only hold on to so many things. So if you don't have to give a character a name, don't give them a name. And she understood that at 8. And so some of us understand that earlier to the degree that I was talking about Wolfe understanding that his life was worth literature, and I didn't understand that until I was in my 30s. When I came to UNCA, I thought being a writer meant I was writing doomy Gothic poems like Jim Morrison trying to meet girls. That's what I thought being a writer was. And then I read Chekhov and thought it was about writing about Russian peasants. And then I read Ernest Gaines, and then I read Flannery O'Connor. And it wasn't until I read Low Comrade Angel that I realized writing is about me. I'm just transmogrifying my own experience and calling it somebody else's. And so when it's your pursuit, you're more conscious of it. But if you're just sitting around with your friends shooting the breeze, you're not conscious of it, but you're still doing it. That was a long answer. Apologize. Other questions? Well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. This concludes our series, and stay tuned for what text I'll be choosing for the fall, but you can guarantee it's going to be a novel. But thank you all so much for coming.